Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Game Industry Legends interview series. My name is Chris Melissinos, and I'm the Principal Evangelist for video games at AWS. And today I will be speaking with Raph Koster, who was named an online game legend at the 2012 Game Developer Online Choice Awards at the annual Game Developers Conference, and has spent more than 30 years in the video game industry. Raph is a multi-talented developer, artist, and business leader who has contributed and led the development of games like Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxies that helped shape the massively multiplayer online game genre. And he continues to push the bounds of virtual worlds to this day. Raph is the author of several books and contributed to or has been featured in more than 20 others, with his most famous book being A Theory of Fun for Game Design. A Theory of Fun is practically required reading for anyone entering the video game industry. And Raph is still on the cutting edge of virtual world leadership, and his latest company, PlayableWorlds, reflects the culmination of his learnings, teachings, and process across his career. It is my absolute privilege to introduce to the Game Industry Legends program, Raph Koster. Raph. And now, are you still muted?
No, I'm here.
Hey, Raph is here. And can everybody go ahead and let me know, can you hear Raph's audio okay? Raph, say hi to the group.
I could grab a guitar off the wall and see if they can hear that.
All right, we're going to talk about some of that stuff, but we have a lot to get through in a limited amount of time. So Tim Bruce is saying, do it. No, Tim, I need to keep him on track today. All right. So what I love to do with guests that come on the program is do something called the Fast Five. So let's talk about your earliest days with computers and video games. What was the first computer or video game system that you remember having in your home?
Pong.
Now,
was probably not an Atari one. It was probably a Sears, one of the Sears ripoff ones.
Same as me. We couldn't afford that Atari branded stuff, right? It was definitely, Sears Pong. You had to smack the TV when the vertical hold, right, would constantly flake out. Oh, it was great, glorious. All right, what was the first arcade game that you remember playing?
Probably Space Invaders. Early on, I loved Space Invaders, really early. Space Invaders, Warlords. I did play Pong in the arcade once or twice. So yeah, that kind of pins it down right around the same time period as that amazing year or so when Star Wars just came out and Battlestar Galactica was on TV and. Yeah. And comic books were good, and all of that happening at once.
And my first real memory, too, was Space Invaders as well. And I remember where it was in the bowling alley by our home in New York. And oh, my goodness gracious, yes. All right, so we got Pong and Space Invaders. When did you start programming, and what was your language of choice when you first started programming? And maybe it wasn't a choice. It's what you had.
It wasn't, yeah. You didn't have a choice. It was basic. That's what came on all the machines. So the first computer that I messed around with in detail was actually my dad's Osborne 1 CPM machine. Mm-hmm. I hacked the code to Colossal Cave so I could see the ending rooms because I couldn't solve the puzzles. And then a great uncle got me an Atari 8-bit computer, and I learned Atari Basic and some assembly language, and even got so far as selling a Ziploc baggie with a game to a classmate.
Yeah, I love that. Now, what was it? Was it a 400 or 800?
No, actually, it was the 600 XL.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it was the very first of the XLs, which were brand new. They'd just come out, and I upgraded pretty quickly from 600 to the 1200 XL, which had all those compatibility issues. And I still have my working 130XE upstairs.
I love that. Yeah. As somebody who delves and works in game history and preservation, I absolutely love that and appreciate it. So thank you for keeping that going. Okay, let's see. From your earliest games, right, that you played, which are the ones that had the biggest, or give me one that had the biggest impact on you? And does that game still, do you still revisit it to this day? Like, which one was it?
Mule.
Yeah, I was about to say, was it going to be Mule, especially on the Atari? Of course.
Of course, it was Mule. I mean, I played the heck out of Archon and all the other Free Fall Associates games.
Sure.
Played other Ozark Softscape games. I was a big fan of the EA games and those sleeves back then, of course. So Seven Cities of Gold was another big favorite. But Mule was very much like super, super influential on me. I still consider it my top game of all time. I buy every new version that gets put out. There's now a Mule Online, you can go play it and play online again, so I own a Mule t-shirt.
Nice. And then how many people, especially when you have the Mule camel, go, oh, that's an AT-AT, and you're like, no, it's not an AT-AT.
No, although I admit when I was a kid, I thought that for a little bit too.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I also really loved arcade games, not just computer games. I beat Laser Blast on the 2600 to the point where it was all exclamation points.
Nice.
And I didn't get my So-On patch until about 4 or 5 years ago, when somebody gave it to me as a Secret Santa gift.
See, we need to bring that back. I think, physical rewards for doing well in games, I think that would go over so big. And, when you were talking about laser attack, I was thinking Mega Mania, or Blast, rather. I was thinking Mega Mania. Yeah, Laser Blast was the one where when you shot, it was the single solid line that would pop up. Mega Mania,
Steve little tanks.
That's right. Steve Cartwright, who developed that, was working here at AWS. And one day he popped up in Slack and was like, hey, man, what are you doing here? I was like, what are you doing here?
Yeah, I think Laser Blaster is actually a David Crane game, I think.
Yeah. All right. Most influential programmer, designer, or industry figure from those early days?
Danny Barry.
There you go, right? Creator of Mule.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mule. Yeah.
Awesome. All righty. Those are the Fast Five. And I love that there's a lot of overlap here. And what I also found out in doing some additional research, I've known you for quite a long time, but it's great to go ahead and dig into my guest's background. So let's go right back to the beginning. You were born on Long Island in 1971. I was born on Long Island in 1970. So we are right there, buddy. It also seems like a lot of people in our generation, right, in the industry, hail from the Northeast, right? A lot of very influential designers. And if they didn't come from the Northeast, they lived there for a particular period of time, right?
That's interesting. I wonder why.
Well, this is for another conversation, but when you look at New York and what they were doing with computers at the time, they were pretty much ahead of everybody else in the country in terms of getting them into schools and adopting that and kind of stuff. So we had access to a lot of kind of that tech awareness. But that's another conversation.
But I didn't, though. I didn't. I grew up. I moved away from Long Island when I was like less than a year old. Moved to Massachusetts, where my parents were going to grad school in that area around all of those colleges there, UMass, Amherst, and all the others right around there. So, yeah, I mean, my family was kind of half hippie, half Latino, just sort of a weird mishmash. Sci-fi readers, and I guess were interested in new tech, but I don't recall seeing a single computer in the schools there.
See, mine was the opposite. A trash 80 Model 3. That is what I started programming. But okay,
no, not there.
But you did move around a lot. So from time Massachusetts, then you were off to Peru, and then Barbados and Haiti. But in your discussions about that time in your life, games factored into your life in a major way. Can you talk about? And it wasn't just video games, right? It was board games and creating those. Can you tell us a bit about that period of time and the kind of games that you would create for you and your friends?
Sure. My mom worked for UNICEF, and my parents were divorced. And so I would be spending summers with my dad. My brother and I would visit him over the summers, but we were living overseas because she was stationed in different countries. And, there's this thing that gets, there's even a Wikipedia article on it. It's called third culture kids. So it's kids who, rather than growing up part of a particular, like they grow up in one place and they're part of a particular culture, when you grow up in a whole bunch of them, you end up feeling like you don't belong to any of them, right? And it can be hard for kids who grew up that way, diplomat kids, military brats, etc., to make friends, actually, right? Like if you know you're going to move, it can be hard to, build up those relationships. And for me, I always say games were glue. They were the thing that helped me connect with the people around, right? Like I would be going to the States, I would see Qbert or Pengo or whatever come out in the arcades. I would go back to Peru and they weren't around. And so I would make board game versions of them, cut up cardboard and everything. And now I think of that as quintessential game design training. Like I would now think of that as a difficult freshman year project assignment. To give to somebody, take this action game, turn it turn-based, right? Like, and still keep it fun. And I would take it into recess. And this started probably around 5th grade, right? 4th or 5th grade, I started doing this. And then it was like 6th grade, maybe, I guess, is when I started programming, right? And got together with some of those same kids, and we would play D&D, and we'd make games, and tried to form a little software company called Protocom and sell games in Ziploc baggies and all of that kind of thing, because we'd heard that Richard Garriott got his start selling games in Ziploc baggies, right? Right. Yeah, and that carried through. Even when I moved to Barbados, I lost nearly all those friends, right? They were thousands of miles away. But I made new friends who would sneak off to play during PE. They would go off to the computer club, and we'd all go play Uridium on the Commodore 64 in there. Oh my
gosh.
So yeah, glue. They were glue for me. They were the way to build up friendships and contacts.
Oh yeah. I mean, and look, you mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, right? And that is like kind of par for the course for those of us in the industry that kind of grew up in that era, and it came, roaring back, right? I mean, D&D is just a massive, massive property. Everybody seems to be playing it. And it played a huge role in your formative game years. What was the most memorable campaign that you remember, and how long did it last? Or is it still ongoing?
It is not still ongoing. While in Peru, using the map from the D&D basic set, the red box set, I carved out a little new... Basically, we did a campaign where we carved out the independence of a new nation called Cambria on the border of a couple of the countries that were defined in there. And we ran that for probably 4 or 5 years. And yeah, later on, I used to write fiction set in that world and all of that. So yeah, that one ran for quite a while. Lots of memories of that. Still in touch with some of the kids that I played with back then in that campaign. And that was in Peru. I didn't have a D&D group in Barbados or in Haiti. In fact, I fell out of D&D then until I got to college.
And we're going to talk about your time in college and what happened right after that. But, one of the things I did want to ask you, since you brought it up before, was about creating your own games on your Atari at home. And so what was the first game? Well, obviously you remember it vividly because you were selling it in a bag. And the reason I bring it up too is one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm going back and remaking the very first video game I ever wrote on my VIC-20 called Space Debris. And I'm doing it all in Pico 8. And it is such a joyous activity. Like, it's just all those feelings of discovering, like, programming and seeing stuff come along. Oh, it's just so great. So what was the game that you were selling in a baggie, your first one?
So Orion was one that we sold. We also sold another one. I can't even remember the title of it, where you tried to protect the moon from meteors. That one was terrible and so buggy. It was awful. I think actually we sold a copy of that first, but Orion is really where I felt like I leveled up my programming chops, such as they were. The very first, basically, Orion was 5 separate programs that one loaded the next. And so it was a 5-stage PvP match between 2 players. And it started with a level of Snake. Then you had a level where you just tried to shoot each other this way. Then you had a level where I figured out how to move in all directions and shoot each other. Then I had a capture the flag level. And then I finally figured out how to actually make character replacement graphics by stage 5. So the walls actually looked like they were little stone walls.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my boot camp. And there are, I had the independent invention of capture the flag for one of the stages, which I hadn't never seen at the time.
Nobody's going to think of this.
Nobody's going to think of that. Yeah, there were already so many versions of it. There are a lot of things in Orion that are still kind of things I lean on today, not just multiplayer, but procedural generation.
Mm-hmm.
Like I did proc gen for the mazes. It was terrible, but I learned how to do it. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot from it, obviously, and kind of cemented a lifelong love of the making. I enjoy making games more than playing them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I always say that's my favorite game.
Yeah.
Recently, really recently, I'd done a video about this game quite a long time ago. Recently, one of the folks in games preservation out in Italy reached out and said, I can't find it on the internet. So I dug it up, and it got posted on the Atari Age forum. So you can go download it now, Chris.
All right.
You can go play Orion.
I will be doing that.
Second player. So
I will be doing that, and then we'll do it on one of the episodes of Rewind.
Oh no.
Yes. Ian, if you can shut your camera off, thank you. You didn't see that, Raph. It's on the other side there. Yes, we'll go play it on Rewind, and we'll talk about some of those old games.
I'll be horrified.
It'll be lovely. It'll be lovely. All right, so let's go ahead and fast forward a little bit. So you're back in the U.S. now, and you're in Florida and finishing high school, and then you moved to Maryland, where you attended Washington College, which is about 2 hours from where I live. I grew up going to Ocean City, Maryland every summer. And in doing this, I was like, let me see exactly where it is. I'm like, oh my goodness, I passed it, a gajillion times. I also realized that Tim Sweeney was starting up his game company in Potomac, Maryland at the time. Bethesda Softworks was in Bethesda, Maryland. Sid Meier was in Hunt Valley, Maryland. We could have all started a company together. We were all just right there. Damn it. All right.
Yeah,
okay.
I didn't know any of them.
No, me either, right? There was no internet. We were all heads down in BBSs at the time. But all right, so you're in college. Surprise, surprise. A storyteller is majoring in English. But about the time you were a senior in college, you started playing around with multi-user dungeons, better known as MUDs. So tell us about that. Like, what did you start playing, at university?
Yeah, so actually, the campus was an Apple campus in the late 80s, which meant it was fully networked with Apple Talk
my goodness.
in all the dorms. Apple was doing that as part of trying to capture the educational market pretty successfully, actually.
Yeah.
that strategy really worked for them. So it wasn't actually that I started with MUDs. I started out hanging out on the campus-wide chat system, which was called Broadcast. And so hung out on this. These are black and white Macs, pluses and SEs and SE30s or whatever. That's actually how I met my wife, was on Broadcast.
Oh.
So we were an online romance in that sense. And I used to run sort of D&D-ish things online via Broadcast and play by email and stuff like that. And so it wasn't actually until I graduated that I discovered MUDs, because we used MUDs to stay in touch with the friends who hadn't graduated yet.
Right.
So it was actually over the summer, right after graduation, that we discovered MUDs. And it was an undergrad friend was who pointed us to it.
But what I do love about that story too, keeping touch with friends that you're now distanced from, is exactly what we see people doing with online games today. I watched my own kids go through that with Toontown Online when we had moved, right? And they were able to play with their friends, right? And so it did provide that sense of connection, right, and engagement, back to people that we care about, which is such an important component of playing online.
Yeah. One thing that people don't appreciate now is that the internet was, obviously it existed, but it was not quite as as it is now. It was like there was a lot of, it was still a pretty disconnected place.
Mm-hmm.
You could only interact with people in news groups and on MUDs, and you could do one-to-one talk sessions, and you could use early IRC, and that was it. Like you didn't have a sense of like people all around you like it is now on the internet. It feels like there's always people around you, comment threads, and you see stuff moving and happening, and other shopper just bought this or whatever. It's everywhere, like this sense of presence. It wasn't like that. Search was asynchronous back then.
Yeah.
When I first got on the internet, you had to fire off Archie and send it to go find things and wait till the next day to hear back.
Yes.
Right? It was very different.
I try to explain to my kids what a web crawler was.
Revelatory.
What a web crawler was. And they were like, you didn't just go somewhere. I said, no, you had it fetch where you could find these things so you could then enter in.
So you could go, yeah. It felt like spelunking caves, You'd log into your local computer's FTP site, the local mainframe. And in the FTP site, somebody might have a folder called games. And you'd open that up, and there would be a document in there, a text doc, called Axel's Mud List. And you'd read that doc, and it would be a list of other sites, other FTP sites, and port numbers. And so you'd go to that, and then you'd FTP or Telnet to a different machine somewhere else on the internet. And you'd download a file there, and then you'd eventually find a game. So it was like treasure hunting, right?
Yeah, it felt so clandestine, right? Like you were just like, oh, I found this thing. I wonder if anybody else knows,
Exactly.
All right.
Game-like in its own right.
Yeah. All right. So you worked on, I think at the time, Legend Mud, right? Which I found out is still up and running today, which is amazing. So what did you learn from those experiences, right, in building and crafting that? Now, I believe, is it your wife that also runs that too, or had?
Did. Yeah.
Okay.
So the way that went was that friend from undergrad was named Sherry Menton, and she was a history major, okay? And she was the one who told us, hey, remember when we played D&D? Turns out people have basically ported D&D into text adventures, and they're called MUDs, and I went looking, and I tried a bunch, and I think I forget what order. I think she found Worlds of Carnage first. And the two of us and Sherry ended up playing Worlds of Carnage. Tried to get a few more of the friends from undergrad on, only a couple did. She met the person who eventually became her boyfriend and partner and so on there. And he was a programmer named Rick Dellerschmidt, who was like this prodigy programmer in Texas, in Austin. Mm-hmm. And we all played Worlds of Carnage for a while, leveled up to max. We were applying for jobs as gods, basically, when Worlds of Carnage went down. And Rick and Sherry went off and started working on a history-themed MUD, Legend MUD. Mm-hmm. And Chris and I got together with somebody else and started working on a different MUD, and ours never got off the ground. So after a little while, we went back and rejoined Rick and Sherry. And we started working on Legend MUD and actually had it open for early testing in the fall of 1993.
Okay.
And it officially opened to the internet on Valentine's Day, 1994. And Legend MUD is themed history the way they thought it was.
Right. And if it was launching on the internet in 94, that meant people were looking at it through Mosaic, right?
No.
And stuff.
No.
What were they
MUDs
using?
Were text-based. There were no.
Oh, that's right. Yet. That's right. Yeah. So it would just be a terminal.
They were looking at it through Telnet.
Yeah.
And you could get some dedicated MUD clients, Tintin, Tiny Fugue. There were a couple of dedicated, but these were text terminal clients.
Yeah.
And Sherry talked the academic computing committee, the computing department at Washington College, into letting us have access to a Mac and running the MUD on the Mac. And we actually, so we ported the MUD to Mac, Rick did. And it was actually officially sponsored by the college for a while. And I guess they got some like, computer science papers out of it or something, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, we also used to just run in swap space on computers in the computer science lab at UT Austin, where Rick was going to school, which meant that the MUD was constantly changing locations. Whenever the temp space filled up, we'd have to pack up and move. And it was a cat and mouse game with the admins who were always trying to delete us.
Oh, that's so... that is the best. People don't understand. It was a struggle and it was glorious all at the same time. All right, we have a lot more to get through here.
Yeah.
All right, so you were working on Legend Mud. You had a video game Nexus that actually published out at the same time, and then
did that with Rick. Yeah,
right. Who you then went off to work with. And we're going to talk about that. So out of college, you managed to get a job working at Origin System, right? The studio built by Richard Garriott, who's Lord British. And you start working on Ultima Online alongside Richard, Starlong, Rick, and Scott Phillips, right? So how did you wind up at Origin from where you were?
Right. So Rick was the one who started breaking into the industry first. He dropped out of UT. I was in grad school. Kristen and I were both in grad school at the University of Alabama. Rick applied at a shareware company that made discs full of Mahjong games and other casual games.
Right.
For him to apply, they asked him to make a game, make a tabletop game of some sort, a digital version. He said, Raph, how about I do the one that you brought with you last time we hung out last spring break? And so I gave him the design to Nexus. He did a digital version. They'd all been given a month to make a game. He made it over the weekend, went in and got the job. And nice. Then Origin, in the form of Starlong, actually approached that company. They were called Morathware. You can Google them. They were famous for their shareware discs. They approached Morathware, who was also local to Austin, about doing co-dev and work for hire to help out on, I think it was an expansion pack to BioForge.
Wow.
And Star, because Star was an AP on that, and Star ended up chatting with Rick, and Rick said, well, my real passion is online games and MUDs. And Star said, we've been trying to get an online Ultima off the ground for years. And so lots of history there, but Rick got hired in order to start building a prototype. He did build a prototype, and using that prototype, they went and got some money direct from Larry Probst, the CEO of EA.
Yeah.
And that was enough to fund a small team. And so, Richard and Star got that money. Star was in charge of the team. And he said to Rick, can you recommend any designers who know what they're doing with MUDs? And he said, yeah, I know this couple in Alabama. And we came in, did the interview, and also some fairly hilarious remote interview questions, which are a really fun anecdote, but lengthy. So maybe we save it for the Q&A later.
Great.
So yeah, we both got lucky. Because they consciously went after a bunch of people from text MUDs, that initial core UO team, 2 kids straight out of high school, myself and Kristen, who were in grad school, one guy who seemed like the oldster of the crowd because he was probably 27, Average age was probably, 25 at most, right? And that was only skewed older because we had one artist who was, at the time seemed incredibly ancient to us, but in hindsight, he must have only been in his 40s, right? So, yeah.
Ancient.
It was a really young, inexperienced, naive crew. And we had massive, massive ideas. We didn't know what was impossible.
The small, young, naive crews are the ones that don't know what they don't know and don't know what they're not supposed to be able to do, so they just go do it, right? Yep. Fortunately, I like to think of myself, there are several of us that have kind of walked those paths that we still try to maintain that same sense of, well, why can't you just go ahead and do it, right? And not get fazed by that stuff. But look, okay, so your experience in building a MUD and obviously in game design and your relationships there crack that door open, get you in. And, you know, being a fan of games like Ultima, like how did it feel to be there, not just at the beginning, but working with Richard Garriott? Like, what was going through your head at the time? Was it like, what the hell?
Yeah. So because I played Ultima on the Atari, you know, I had not gotten to play many of the recent Ultima games. The last one that I played and beaten was Ultima 3, because I think they stopped porting them to Atari after Ultima 4.
That wasn't that sure. Shroud of the Avatar, right? 4?
No. Shroud of the 5? Avatar was much later. Quest of the Avatar was 4.
That's right. Quest of the Avatar. Yeah.
Ultima 3 was Exodus, right?
Yeah.
And which meant actually that, you know, basically I drifted away from Ultima right when the Virtues first came into the series, because it's really 4 through 7 that are now regarded as like the classic, amazing period of Ultima. So when we joined, we had to go back and play them all and catch up on gaming PCs, which we weren't used to using because we had switched to Mac because we'd been on a Mac campus. So PC gaming had passed me by. I didn't know anything about it. And it wasn't until we're working at Origin we had to rediscover PC gaming.
You're like IRQ5 for a sound blast. Like, what the hell are you talking about? You don't just plug it in and it works?
First day was September 1st, 1995. Richard was actually running Ultima 9 mostly.
Wow.
And so we saw him periodically and occasionally, but you know, we weren't working with him constantly day to day. We were working with Star, with other folks. You know, people from Origin who got assigned onto the project.
Yeah. All right. So now you're in there working, going by the moniker Designer Dragon. And you became
Ultimate
the lead.
Dragon.
That's
UDIC.
right.
That was the Ultimate Dragon's internet chapter fan club.
See? All right. And so you became the lead designer on the game. How closely did Ultima Online align with the previous Ultima games? And by the way, listen to that alliteration. Also, how did it deviate, right, aside from being a MMORPG?
It aligned in a couple of ways by accident, and it aligned in some other ways because we did a concentrated effort to capture the spirit of what was in the single player games. When my wife and I applied, they asked us to write up, send us a sample quest that you've made, right? And look at this code and things like that. And we actually sent in a design saying, well, here's a quest, but we wouldn't do it that way anymore. We would lean towards more simulation. We would lean towards Ultima 7 had kind of really started moving into more simulation-y gameplay. In the Ultima series, you could famously bake bread in there and a couple of other things. But it wasn't a full end-to-end simulation. You could do these things, but the game wasn't built as a simulation from the bottom up in the same way. We sent in that a full world simulation design doc and said, never mind old school quests. We should build a simulated world. Then we showed up at work and got told, oh, look what we're going to make, a whole simulated world. Oh, God, you're using our idea? Right? Like that was, shocking. And I wasn't originally going to be the lead designer. They had a single player Ultima lead designer on it. But eventually he went away and I ended up as the creative lead. So it was not always a clean fit with Ultima. Like we struggled to figure out how to incorporate the virtues, which were very much something that came out of linear narrative, which is not what MMOs did all that well, right? So yeah, but we tried to capture as much of the history and the lore and get it in there as we could.
Very cool. All right. So look, there are a couple of very famous events that happened with Ultima Online, and you're breaking new ground, right? Of course, we also see, like Don Dagla was also doing Neverwinter Nights online, right, at AOL. We had MUDs that are going on. We had John Smedley and his team spinning up EverQuest, right? So Meridian 59 was that. So we had kind of in this kind of a weird space where everybody is just kind of trying to figure out what it means and how to put these things together and how to balance this. No one had ever done it at this scale before. And there were a couple of famous things that happened in Ultima Online. One of them was the collapse, right, of the virtual ecology system, right? But that's a big story to talk about, and one that I've actually shared recently. But the one I want to ask you about, maybe if you can briefly tell us what this was and what happened there, was the death of Lord British in the game, and that which should not have happened. So can you tell us real quick, like what the hell happened?
Yeah, so we had added a whole bunch of spells to the magic system that were ideas that we'd brought over from Legend Mud, like Wall of Stone and Wall of Fire. Mm-hmm. So there was a Wall of Fire spell. If you logged in via the game client, there was a checkbox to turn on invulnerability if you had the God mode client, as opposed to the regular play client. It didn't save in between sessions.
Okay.
Lord British and Lord Blackthorn were doing a tour of cities, and this was an in-game event, right? And this was prior to the launch of the game. It was during the beta testing period, but the beta testing period was, it was getting press coverage, people were paying attention, all of that, and it meant that there were crowds of people at every stop, at every city. When they got to the city of Moonglow, all the avatars turned around, pulled down their pants, and then bowed and mooned them in Moonglow, right? Like stuff like that was happening. And then they get to, I forget what city it was, they got to that city and there was a micro riot. A player named Rains, who had skills as a thief and a mage, was rifling through somebody's backpack and found a Wall of Fire scroll. So he cast it in the middle of the crowd. And Richard said, "Ha ha, thou canst not slay Lord British, you fool." Walked into the Wall of Fire and died because the invulnerability flag was off. I was not actually logged in watching the event, but lots of other people at Origin were. So I remember Scott Phillips raced into my office and go, "Richard's dead." And I'm like, "Wait, what?
Oh my.
What just happened?" And he goes, in the game, right? And part of the reason that mattered was because there was a tradition of ways to kill Lord British in the single-player Ultima games. One of them was you could knock a plaque off a wall and kill him by having it hit his head, which was based on a real-world incident that happened at the Origin office, where a big old sign on the wall, the Origin sign, fell on his head and knocked him out. Wow. So, there was a moment of confusion. Did something happen? But it turned out it was only virtual. The game masters who were online protecting him summoned a bunch of demons that slew everyone in the crowd. Reigns got banned, and it made international news.
Yeah, it did. I mean, even people that didn't play were like, heard about this, That's right. Yeah, which is sort of hard to believe today. But, some of the things that were happening, like Ultima Online was written up in Wired, was written up in, it was a big deal. People, it's hard to appreciate how weird it was to be able to hang out with thousands of other people. MUDs existed, but they were text-based. The other graphical games peaked at a couple hundred, right? Yeah.
And we just had more freedoms in the game. So, yeah, Lord British became Lord British meat pie and barbecue.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, right? I mean, it's it was so new, and it was like, what do you mean somebody died in this game? You can kind of hear the alarm bells going off for very concerned citizenry, right? About, it's going to kill. All right. So again, we still have so much to get through. We're going to probably start the Q&A a little bit later because there are a few big beats I want to get through
You're
too.
You're up to 1996.
Okay, yeah, no, but we're gonna get you through. We're gonna get you through. All right, so at the beginning of 2000, you leave Origin Systems after about 5 years, and then you joining along with mutual acquaintance Rich Vogel, right? So you join Smedley's Barrett Interactive, who's now Daybreak Games, right? Who was spun out of Sony's 989, right?
It was Variant, and not yet. Today it's Daybreak,
Right.
but it was in the process of changing into being part of Sony Online Entertainment.
Yeah, because my original recollection at the time that I met Smed and Adam and Kelly Flock, who was then helming it right when it came back in, right, spun it out. They did the EverQuest stuff, and then launched and went, oh, okay, we need to bring them back in, right?
Yep.
And so that all happened in like this 3-month window that you joined them. They get reacquired by Sony, and you are working for them there, and you're now working on the Star Wars Galaxies MMO. Like, what the hell, man? Like,
it was a surprise to us. We left Origin as a team. Richard was going. He was gone to go do Destination Games, which later turned into a piece of NC Soft and so on. We had been working on Privateer Online. That had been canceled. And when that was canceled, Rich Vogel basically said, let's all go. We'll put ourselves on the market as a team. And basically started having conversations with a variety of companies. And it was Variant who said, hey, we'll open an Austin office for you. And we actually started working on pitches for new games. We were exploring doing a pirate game and, whatever, looking at different things to do. We knew that they had the Star Wars license that had been public for a while.
Mm-hmm.
We assumed there was a team there working on it, which there was. And that therefore we're not going to be doing it. We're doing something else. And it didn't work out that way.
I mean, but again, now you're working on, like, again, freaking Star Wars, right? So you're tasked with helping to build this MMO for a mass audience franchise, right?
Yep.
You're leading a team now of more than 100, people. Like, how did it feel in that moment? Like edge of the cliff or on a rocket?
No, cliff for sure.
Yeah.
The history there is that the Star Wars project existed and was in prototype phase, but the now Sony Online did not have enough bandwidth to actually do it as well as all of their internal projects in terms of leaders in particular. So picture this, one person was in charge of both that and PlanetSide and was, wait for it, the producer on both projects and directing both games.
Okay.
And there was no way, right?
Right.
And so they asked Rich and I to come out and kind of do a status report. Hey, come in and look at the game, tell us where it is. And we said, well, all power to this guy, but all credit to him. It was Kevin McCann, and he's great. Mm-hmm. But we were like, this is, everything's moving really slow. And there were interesting, weird technical entanglements. Like the two games were using different engines. Mm-hmm. Galaxies was actually using an offshoot of the EverQuest 2 engine. EverQuest 2 was in very early development still. So the engine was changing out from under them all the time. There were a whole bunch of challenges like that. And the upshot was that they said, especially knowing that we'd worked on Privateer, they handed us the project. And suddenly we were going to end up managing a project that split development between two locales at a time when that was not at all how you made games. The entire programming team in San Diego quit in a fury because their game was taken away from them. And their technology base too, because we switched engines, right? It was actually very uncomfortable. I remember when we flew back after that visit, Rich and I were sitting next to each other on the plane, and just the conversation went about wow, this is going to be really hard. Yeah, this is going to be really painful. Can we get more time? They'll only give us maybe a year. Well, there's no way to do it in that time. Yeah, but it's Star Wars. Yeah, but it'll be really hard. Yeah, but it's Star Wars. I mean, that's how it went. And, we got back to Austin and we said to the team, so there's this and we don't have to do it. It's going to be really hard and the timeline will be impossible. And, it'll be mad crunch in every possible way. And the team said, yeah, but it's Star Wars.
I mean, that's a valid answer. It's Star Wars.
It is a valid answer. And so it was always a project that was under the gun, under an enormous amount of time pressure, from the very beginning. And there was a game design, and we got asked, make it diverge more from EverQuest, make it much more sandboxy so that we don't cannibalize our EverQuest audience. And that led to, we had to redesign the things that were in there. Like, it had action combat originally, but PlanetSide was essentially developing that. It was on the fly development with both games, right? And we're like, well, we can't take that risk. We no longer have time. Yeah. Right. It was a very challenging development cycle. When we were doing Ultima Online, it was 2D. We built it and launched it too early for sure. But I mean, we did that in basically 2 years and 3 months. When we did Galaxies, now we're full 3D. We're developing morphing character customization and new systems for player housing and all this other stuff. And we built Galaxies, and from that restart point, I think it was 2 years and 9 months.
Wow. Incredible. Well, look,
another year.
And I remember when it launched, and everybody was so excited to get in there. It didn't
work.
Huh?
You couldn't log in on the first day.
Well, which to date, right, we still have issues around. You think we would have collectively as an industry figured out some of that? We're getting better all the time at that, right? But it was around that time, that it was launched where you and I actually first met. So I remember it was at E3, and we were there with good mutual friend of ours, Mark Delore. I remember you showing me a terrain demo that you'd worked on that demonstrated like real-time fluid dynamics and terrain deformation, right? That was really pretty stunning to see. And those concepts would continue to play a part in your career, but we're going to get to that. But you also shared a story. I wonder if you remember this. You shared a story about how players work together to break games or solve problems. So you told me about a puzzle that you created that included like a cipher, among other things, required players like traveling to different planets, time of day mechanics, all this crazy stuff. And then you were like, and they broke it so fast. Like, do you remember that story? Like, what was that?
Yeah, it was a Rebel versus Imperial event in Star Wars Galaxies. We made it so that different characters across the entire game each dropped one line of 2 different ciphered messages. So you had to actually go kill a bunch of rebels to get all the lines of the rebel message, kill a bunch of Imperials to get all the lines of the Imperial message. They were both encrypted in subtly different ways, same general approach. There were clues embedded in the lines that gave you the idea of what order they went in. Each of the lines was actually encrypted. They were all using like a ROT13, but every line used a different rotation, and you had to figure out what the rotations were based on what the order was, which was based on the fact that the lines had hidden mathematical constants in them. And then even once you did that, you'd look at them and go, they're gibberish. And that's because what I had done was arrange the messages into a grid, and the lines were actually the columns of the message, not the rows. So you couldn't use letter frequency analysis in order to determine that it was a ROT13 or whatever. There were players on the forums who worked for the NSA who were borrowing computer time, which was not the right way to solve it, right? It was a logic puzzle, not really an encryption puzzle.
Right.
They solved it in less than 48 hours.
Incredible. And you assumed it was going to take weeks for them to figure this out, right?
Yeah, we figured it would take longer than 48 hours for sure.
Oh my gosh.
But, oh well.
Yeah. All right. So look, Star Wars Galaxies would run for 8 years, right? It had 3 expansions in there. And ultimately it shut down literally like right before Star Wars The Old Republic, which was delivered by BioWare guys, right? Doctors Greg and Ray in December of 2011. You both shut down and started up in the same month. There's still some private servers to this day that keep pieces of Star Wars Galaxies alive. So what you built truly was lasting, right? Even if it wasn't officially carried on by Sony at the time. And so it's around this time, right, 2003, and you're promoted to the chief creative officer at SOE. And that obviously, bookended your time there. So we're jumping back half a step here. 2003, you're promoted to chief creative officer at SOE, and you work on a number of titles. And for the record, Untold Legends was an awesome dungeon crawler, right? I loved that stuff. It made the PSP really awesome. And it's something I mentioned to you before we started the program here today. So in 2003, I had spinal fusion in the spring of that year, wound up in a clamshell brace for 6 months while recovering. But the first convention I could attend after being cleared for flying was the very first Austin Game Developers Conference in Austin, Texas. And there was a morning session with, I believe, a keynote speaker, a Mr. Raph Koster. And the title of his presentation is A Theory of Fun. And it was really one of the most creative and thought-provoking presentations I'd ever seen. And there are certain things that you mentioned in there that I still, use to this day, talking about our systems of cognition to do facial recognition, right? How we're pattern matching creatures and all of these things. In fact, I was telling my wife the other night, as I was mentioning we were going to be talking about your tic-tac-toe example. Why do we stop playing tic-tac-toe? And we learn because it doesn't become fun when we understand how to stalemate it all the time, right? But it's because of your approach to storytelling and art and the ability to really distill down these very complex concepts into more digestible examples that made it so impactful. And I was there front row on the day you sprang it on the world. So my question is, how long had you been working on the theories and concepts in the presentations? Is this a culmination of your life's work, or was this something that kind of was inspired and kind of came into being?
Oh gosh. Back then I typically put my presentations together the night before the talk.
I do the same thing.
Yeah, and that one was all it was all cartoons, right? Like it was literally like MS Paint drawings, right? Yeah. And it used Comic Sans for the font. The ideas in it had come from chatting with Dave Rickey, who is somebody that I knew from the Mud Dev mailing list going back years. He's an MMO designer and game designer. And Noah Falstein, longtime game designer, worked on Sinistar and LucasArts games and so on. I'd been chatting with Noah. He had this concept of natural funativity, which was basically, hey, there's got to be an evolutionary reason why humans enjoy having fun and playing games.
Right.
And I'd been reading a bunch of books on cognitive science at the time. Thinking Fast and Slow and lots of other books in that vein. And it just sort of all went into the bucket, and there was no lengthy research period or anything. It's like, oh crap, I need a keynote for tomorrow here. And yeah, it was very, yeah. But to me, the trick on things like that in general is, it isn't so much that you're working on it all the time. It's more that you're reading, you're absorbing ideas, you're trying to rearrange them and think about them yourself. And in my case, presenting them back out is a way of thinking about problems. Yeah. It's a way of chewing through them, trying to organize them into concepts in a tidy way. So yeah, that's how it happened. And it so happened that some folks in the audience, it's been long enough now. This was over 20 years ago, but yeah. Two people in particular, Kurt Squire, Ben Sawyer. I think it was Ben Sawyer was the one who said, should do this as a book. And he actually came and talked to me at E3 and talked me into it and said, I know a publisher. And then I had to go, replace the MS Paint cartoons with real ones, still on a pretty tight deadline, and turn what had been 30 slides or something into something that could go in print, right? I was like, and because Ben's original idea was, oh, this could just be like a chapbook, could be a fun little chapbook. And it was a bit longer than that by the time I finished it.
Yes, it was. And it was, I mean, it is, again, it is still held up as one of the best books on explaining why things are fun. I've sold it's got to be more than 30,000 copies translated into a variety of different languages. You have your own website.
Yeah, it's actually well over 80,000 copies in English. I don't even know how many in other languages, and it's in 7 languages maybe now.
Incredible. And people can go ahead and actually see, the website, right? Theory of Fun, to go ahead and learn more about the book. And it's one that is dog-eared and sits in my collection when I refer to. So once again, you built something that lasts beyond, the time that you were creating it and had huge impact on the space. All right. I know we're running short on time too. So let me get back. Let me drag us back in here. So prolific author, impacting the industry with the way you think about things and describe these and tell them in such eloquent, story-like content. Really just incredible. All right. So now you leave SOE in 2006 to start your own company, MetaPlace. But you're working on one of the biggest franchises in games. Like, why leave to start your own company at that time?
So I had been running an R&D group at Sony Online, and the R&D group got dismantled and applied to working on this new project that was actually fairly troubled. It had gone through a lot of ups and downs, called Free Realms. I'd been asked to take over Free Realms, and I didn't really want to. It was Smedley's pet project, and I didn't think I'd actually have autonomy on it. I had been trying to get Sony to pay attention to the burgeoning web. Web 2.0 was happening. I had actually brought Sony Puzzle Pirates, and they turned it down.
100% written in Java, by the way, of course.
Yep. I brought them Second Life, and Sony declined to publish it.
Wow.
I brought them Toontown, and they did cut that deal. Yeah. Toontown in a Box was because I connected
Jesse Shell, right?
Jesse and Joe with the folks at Sony Online. But I was seeing all of this movement happening, and the Web 2.0 and all the things it meant. All of the R&D projects I'd been working on, they all got essentially shelved. The very last thing we did was extensive data mining and social graph analysis of users. And on the way out the door, we actually provided that data to academic researchers. And a huge amount of the academic research on games is from that data set. That's what kicked off a lot of it. Wow. Because they'd asked me to do so much of the PR work and the public speaking, it meant that I'd been going to all these Silicon Valley conferences for a few years, which meant that I had met venture capitalists. And so since I didn't want to work on Free Realms and I wanted to explore this stuff, and I was really interested in continuing to work basically towards the metaverse. When I first joined the exec team on Sony Online, Russell Shanks said to me, "Hey, so what do you aspire to career-wise?" And I said, "Reinventing the internet."
So, the title for this section in my notes, I had put in something like, time for the metaverse. MetaPlace, right? Because that's what you were doing. And if you remember back in that time, there was that project, the Metaverse Project. I believe you were one of the people involved in that. I was asked to participate, so I did remotely. I couldn't be out there at the time, but we were all really thinking about this. Like, what's this going to look like for me? And I still talk about it to this day. HTML5 in the web. It is a universal translator that sits basically on every connected device we have. Like, if we can understand how to make it work for games in a really reliable, consistent way, it could be absolutely, no pun intended, game-changing. And the recent changes to HTML5 really are putting us in a place now where publishing out to the web, and we're watching companies do this all over the place now. But you were doing this, earlier on. One of the things that you did demonstrate, right, in MetaPlace, which were these individual cities or environments that people could stand by. I think at peak, you had like something like 40,000 different destinations in there. One of the things you demonstrated was terrain deformation and modification, right? Again, going back to an earlier demo that I'd seen you do, 5 years, 6 years prior.
Yeah. Yeah, MetaPlace actually was doing it, and it wasn't anywhere near as sophisticated as that, as the older R&D project. A lot of what we were trying to do with MetaPlace was make games work the way the web does.
Right.
So the client ran embedded in the browser. We had a generic game server that was the equivalent of a web server. A text file full of tags was the way the games were defined, just like a web page. The network protocol was sending tags down a telnet connection, which is just how the web worked, right? Like it really was that. And it did open up just an enormous amount of creativity. It was basically a backend for Ready Player One, just in 2D and embedded in browsers.
Yeah, and I remember when it launched, I remembered standing up my own space in there. I remember when I saw you at, I believe it was GDC or maybe in Austin GDC, where you were talking about this. And was that around the same time you also gave the talk on like MMOs and dinosaurs going extinct? Is that the same?
Dinosaurs going extinct talk was a little earlier. I think
Okay.
that talk may have been right when I left to go do MetaPlace.
Got it.
Might have been right around then. MetaPlace, I left SOE in 06. And MetaPlace was out there for early testing by 07.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all those things come together. You have such a long and prolific career, Raph. Is right. Sometimes it's hard to keep them all in order. All right, but we're going to fast forward this because I want to talk about what you're doing today. So you sell the company to Playable, which was also the home of another famous designer, all-around brilliant human being, Steve Meretzky, right? And that's shortly acquired by Disney. And so you're working on a variety of things over at Disney. You leave in 2010. You are working independently as a contractor for about 8 years. And then 2018, and you worked with, Google, companies as large as Google, down to independent studios. Awesome. And then 2018, you found PlayableWorlds and assembled a leadership team, again, with more awesome mutual friends like Eric Goldberg, right, and Gordon Walton. And, I also, wonder why I'm never included in these discussions, but okay. Anyway.
You always have jobs already. and famous live stream podcast shows.
Oh, there we go. You are too kind. You are too kind. All right. So PlayableWorlds is still under wraps to a certain extent. And this is going to be going up publicly, right? But if you lean into the experiences, that you kind of are a master at crafting, right? Social, multiplayer, narrative, based living, kind of breathing worlds. But PlayableWorlds is a bit different, right? Being, as you describe it, a cloud native experience. When you say it's a cloud native experience, I mean, your games are all connected to the web running on servers. What's the difference between what PlayableWorlds is doing as a cloud native experience versus what we've seen before?
In a lot of ways, from the boring technical angle, it's not that boring to you and me, but maybe to others. From the boring technical angle, it is similar to what we were doing with MetaPlace in terms of making games work the way the web does. Only back then, cloud as a service wasn't really a thing. Right. We built a whole bunch of tech ourselves. Now we have all of this amazing infrastructure. If you look at the way games are delivered, online games in particular, right? If you were running Amazon the way that we run online games today, you would have to patch Chrome every time Amazon added a book to the catalog.
Right.
Which makes no sense, but that's how game tech has been working, right? And games are drifting more and more into live service all the time, everywhere. The top 10 by revenue on every platform now is live service games.
Right.
But the tech that we use isn't really oriented around live service. It's still, even though we're running games like Fortnite on it, right? Like, it's still really built with assumptions that are more like the assumptions of shipping a disc, right? It's just that now you download the disc off Steam, but it's still around shipping a packaged good, not something that's alive and constantly updating and is super dynamic and admits of UGC and all of that kind of thing.
Basically, an environment that, that as you said, you download is connected and you can inject things into it, but you still have kind of this cordoned off bespoke piece of software versus something that's constantly modifying, living, breathing, like the web does, right, in the background, right?
Exactly. So PlayableWorlds, basically, one crude way to think of it is, hey, I want to go make games like Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxies with all that sandboxy goodness, but I want to build it on technology more like what MapPlace had, modernized.
Yeah.
That's one way to think of it, right? So there's a whole bunch of technical benefits we get from being cloud native. We can deliver updates to the game without needing to patch your game client. We can stream assets down on the fly, which means we can do updates on a really regular cadence. We can take advantage of the hugely increased compute power. Like we literally have 10,000 times the computing power than we did in the days of Ultima Online.
Yeah.
And yet you go back and you play Ultima Online and you go, this world is incredibly richly interactive. Why can't I do these things in today's games? Right? So by going cloud native, we are unlocking that compute power to be able to do some of those magical interactive things again that you haven't been able to do it, right? Like,
right.
These days it's deeply unusual to run into an online game that breaks about 150 concurrent on a single process. Ultima Online did 800 on a process and almost 3,000 in one world. That was 25 years ago now, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that any of the technical choices that have been made since then are wrong. It's that they optimize towards a different set of problems than it turns out where the industry is going.
Yeah.
Right? What developers need is tech that lets them update constantly, build more dynamic worlds, because the cost curve on building games is going bananas, right?
Yeah, it is.
And so it's about 10x every decade, right? And so you need platforms that let you iterate quickly, find the fun, update really readily to drive regular engagement, not cost a fortune on building static content. So the more simulation, the more AI, the more procedurality you get in there, the more you can bring costs down in order to deliver what we believe will be the most alive game worlds ever made, right? So that's a big part of what we're doing, is bringing that to games, and take a world like that and drop on it all of the kinds of gameplay that people used to think we were weird for letting people decorate houses, bake bread, go fishing. And today, those are the foundations of all of the broad, more casual genres, right?
Yeah.
People used to say, oh, those sandbox MMOs, that's the niche. Slaying orcs is the mainstream.
Right.
Shoes on the other foot.
Yeah.
Right? Baking bread in a game is much more mainstream than slaying an orc is.
Yes.
It turns out. So I feel vindicated by all the Animal Crossing and Breath of the Wild crafting and all of those kinds of things, because our competitors used to run ads. Do you play to crush or do you play to bake bread? It turns out bake bread. Yeah, that turns out to be the answer. So PlayableWorlds is out to bring that spirit back.
Amazing. Amazing. Again, I know that it's early, and it's not that it's early, it's that it's not public yet. So we're not going to dig into those questions. I'm going to have you back on after you launch so we can explore the world. We've actually, since you all are running on AWS, we've had a chance to actually get into one of the servers and play around with it. I've seen the evolution of this in multiple times. I've seen you over the past couple of years and seeing how it's grown. As I mentioned before, terrain deformation, right? big in Raph's kind of, it is part of your milieu, right? So I think it's extraordinary what you're doing, and really is, again, kind of this culmination of how you think about worlds and how you think about emergent story, and the scale of these things. Really just amazing. So when it launches, we're going to have you back in here. But we're getting to the end of the interview portion here. So I wanted to ask just a couple of quick things before we wrap up and have some AWS employees ask you some questions. So what has you most excited about where the games industry is headed today?
Well, I think, as you know, we're actually in a tough spot as an industry right now, right? It's a challenging time. ironically, one of the things that is most controversial right now, of course, is what's happening with generative AI. I think that what is likely to happen with all of that is that we are going to start using it in our tool chains, not to replace content creators, but to accelerate content creation by expert creators. I think it's going to go down the same pathway that all the artists today, they don't model trees anymore. They use SpeedTree.
Right.
They don't hand paint all their textures. They use Substance. And these were procedural tools that when they first came out, people went, oh, but I can do it better by hand. And as the game scope has grown, we use those tools. They
Right.
speed us up. It's like using a word processor instead of a typewriter, and a typewriter instead of writing by hand, right?
Right.
And I suspect that a lot of the Gen AI stuff is going to go that way. And so my hope is that it helps reduce and lower development costs.
Yeah.
Development costs are the bane of the industry. They favor incumbents rather than innovative indies. They push us to spend on graphics and marketing more than on innovative gameplay. When we spend on graphics and marketing and not innovative gameplay, we cap our own audience, because the only way to expand the audience is to present experiences that non-gamers haven't seen before. That's how you expand the number of players in the world.
Right.
And so, it's a bit of a trap to just keep raising the budgets. It ends up making things less innovative, concentrating the market, and all those things can be bad for kind of the innovation in the industry. And I want new games. I want more kinds of games and more players of games. To me, they're the glue, remember? That's what I want. So I'm hopeful that some of these techniques and procedural techniques and embracive simulation, which we're seeing more and more, like what Tears of the Kingdom did, and those things leverage the power of computers for more than putting pixels on screen.
Yeah.
And to me, that's kind of the great hope, right? Is that can kind of reset the baseline for all of us and let us spend more time on being creative, honestly. I think that's kind of the key.
Yeah. And I think, with the number of indie games that we're seeing just kind of exploding into the, millions and millions of players, right? Really kind of leans into that it doesn't always have to be renderer crushing, AAA, $100 million, into that kind of development to be a great game. Great games are great games underneath, right? Regardless of that layer. And so to your point, and something that I echo and completely believe too, is I want to taste more. I want to, be part of more stories and more worlds. And I can't do that if everything's 120 hours. But I can do it when it's a 10-hour game, or I'm in a world where I can experience a bunch of these different 6-hour sort of experiences, right? And we're doing that with all other forms of media. Games are not going to be any different, right? Yep. And so, maybe we finally pushed it so far that it's left this, and chaos loves a vacuum, right? Opportunity loves a vacuum, left this vacuum there for those games to not come in and go, well, I could either do this or I can have these 10 experiences for the same amount of time. Maybe I'll go lean in there, Yeah,
I think, one of the things that's challenging about that is we now do have that massive explosion of indies, and now that's resulted in a discovery problem. And it's hard to find the titles that you like. And lots of good games never get seen by anybody. And what happens is, again, the ones who have a money advantage end up winning out because they can, pop to the top via marketing.
Unless I can send a text to all my friends that has a web link they click and there's nothing to download. It just goes off and plays.
That's
right.
Basically, that's all about new forms of distribution, new ways to get in. And that's a place where we shouldn't be shipping giant blobs. We should be streaming stuff down on the fly. We should be making it easier to get in. Exactly, right? Yeah. Because we do need to change the ways in which we built some of this stuff in order to get to that future we want.
Yeah. Well, Raph, look, I know we went over time here. I want to thank you so much for taking time with us today and walking through your incredible, impactful impactful career. I'm looking forward to seeing more about PlayableWorlds and to have you back on after you guys, go to public launch. But once again, thank you so much for spending time with us today and walking us through just these incredible projects and the amazing work to do. Make sure you go ahead and check out Raph's website. The link will be in the comments below. But Raph, again, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
My pleasure.
All right.